Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Cheryl Howard, and what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is some of the photography terms and try to help us make sense of all that photography jargon. So, this is a new program for me, so bear with me. Okay, so hopefully we can get this going. Let's see, here we go. All right, and now I have to move me out of the way, hopefully. Okay, there I go. Move me down out of the way so you can see everything. Okay. All right. So there I am out of the way. Hopefully you can still see me. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is DSLR. It's digital lens reflective camera. That's what DSLR stands for. And which is they're different from SLRs, which are film cameras, and DSLRs are totally digital. And both have a camera mount. They both have interchangeable lenses, and some of you may even have point and shoots, but they're not SLRs, and neither are the DSLRs. They're just the old-fashioned point and shoot camera. Um, Next term we're going to talk about is shutter speed. And shutter speed is an element of exposure, and it's the duration of time in which light is allowed through your lens, and also how fast your shutter opens and closes. The next term we're going to talk about is aperture or f-stop, and those two terms are interchangeable. And you may hear people refer to either term, and they refer to the same thing. It's a measure of the diameter of the aperture, or how much the shutter opens to let the light in. And we'll talk about some of these terms more in detail, such as shutter speed and aperture, exposure and ISO, a little bit more in detail at our future um, presentations. The next one is depth of field, or DOF, and it's the amount of foreground and background that's in focus with the subject. And simply put, it's the blur behind or in front of the subject that's in focus. And personally, I like a shallow depth of field, which means that the main subject, is in focus and the background is blurred. And this what works well for people when you're trying to get a individual that's in focus, especially if you have a busy background. It's nice to have that blurred background because now your attention is focused on the person and not all that busyness. Whereas with the landscape shots, you may want everything in focus. So, and that's how you can use depth of field. The next one we're going to talk about is exposure, which is the amount of light that enters the lens and strikes the film or the sensor. And exposures are broken down into aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So you need all of those, three of those elements to get those right, to get that perfect shot. And it's also a combination of the intensity and duration of light. So if you got a good shutter speed and a good aperture, you usually will have a good exposure, along with your ISO, which is the next term, which is the speed at which the sensor reacts to the light. So we'll talk about those again more in detail at our next encounter, next presentation. Next, we have white balance, is the process of removing unrealistic color casts. And you might see that like in this room now. We have a kind of a color cast behind me, that yellowish. Whereas if we put more light, we could brighten up the room and the walls wouldn't look with that yellow color cast. And so that's how we can get the the color cast out there so the subjects appear more white in person. And that's especially true with people's shots. You want to get that brightness of the skin tones right out of the camera, which is our next term, which is SOC, SOOC, which is straight out of the camera. So you get your exposure, your ISO, your depth of field, aperture, shutter speed, get all of those, then straight out of the camera, then we have what's called that perfect shot. And it requires few adjustments with some of your um, software, which for me personally, I'm going to need to do a little bit of adjustment, seems like most of the time, but that's okay. We strive for perfection, but we don't always get it. The next term is focal points, and that's picking a subject or an object that you want to be in focus. So if it's a person, I do a lot of nature photography, so it's the bird. And one of the things that helps get it in focus is to try to focus in on the eyes of the subject. If you get the eyes in focus, then the person or the bird or the mountain, the building, finding that spot that you can focus in on to get everything in focus, your focal point. The next what term is composition. What are you aiming at? What's your visual artistic layout for your image? And some of the things you look at is your leading lines. Um, Not everything has to be in the center of the frame, like the person. Sometimes it's nice to have your image off to the side. And one of the things we'll talk about in our future encounters is rule of thirds, is where you position it, your main subject. And not always your main subject has to be in the center of the frame. It makes it more eye appealing if it's not quite in the center of the frame. And if the person is looking off to the side, they need room to stare, or what is the bird looking at? Because you always have that sense of wonder if you have your image framed too closely, and you can't your subject doesn't have any staring room. And the last term we'll talk about today is bokeh. It's blur, I'm sorry, blur, or the quality of blur. And you can either, it's an artistic effect, you can either add it later in your editing software. You can add bokeh, you can add that in, or you can create it. Especially on sunny days when you have the sun out, you can get that bokeh effect. So it's an artistic effect that you can add, and it also, it gives some elements to your picture. So I hope that helps a little bit today. So we talked about DSLRs, the digital cameras, shutter speed, the element of exposure, aperture or f-stop. Those are two interchangeable terms. Depth or field, how much of the foreground or background is in or out of focus. Exposure, the amount of light. ISO, the speed at which the sensor is reacting to light. White balance, getting rid of some of those color casts. Um, Sock, straight out of the camera. Focal points, picking an object or subject to that you want to be in focus. Composition, your artistic layout, framing of your subject. And then lastly, we talked about bokeh, that artistic blur that you can add to your image to give it a little more appeal or creativity. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this presentation today, and I look forward to you joining me next time. Take care, and I'll see you around. Bye bye now.